Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's always exciting to talk about money these days because it seems to be a very hot topic with global interest rates and inflation and what have you coming. So we're very excited this morning to have this little presentation in partnership with our member Global Public Affairs. I want to send a special thank you to our supporters, Epiroc, Ericsson, SKF, Secure State Cyber, Viaplay, and Novia. And we all know that there are a lot of interest from Sweden to do business with Canada. We were sort of on a good traction there before the pandemic, and then we got a big pin in the wheel. Things stopped, and then we are where we are today. But you can see from all the activities between our governments, Crystal Freeland recently being over in Stockholm, meeting with our Canadian ambassador Jason Latour, Marcus Wallenberg, and others. There's some really great initiatives and commitments. So this bilateral work that we are unpacking and sharing, there are obviously always opportunities and risks. And as a side note, this is actually our 80th year anniversary for Canada-Sweden's bilateral relations. So, aside from the hockey, we have many synergies. And today we don't want to talk about hockey because it's the wrong teams winning. But we're going to move on. And we thank Ted Gertetzner, Vice President, National Practice Lead Energy, Environmental Resources for Global Public Affairs, for taking time out today and sharing his thoughts about our budget and what has come out. So we're very excited to hear this. So Ted, without further ado, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks, Len, and thanks, Marie, for helping set this up. We're a relatively new member of the chamber, and but we're finding it very useful because we've all of a sudden, primarily spurred, I think, by the war in Ukraine, a lot of interest in Swedish companies have come to us asking us for assistance coming into Canada, understanding the Canadian landscape, and we're seeing a lot of varied industrial companies, some through the Wallenberg organization, interested in Canada. So quite exciting time. And I've not met Jason Latour, but I gather he's quite a force in terms of driving Canadian and Swedish relations. And I've had the pleasure of being at hosted by the ambassador, Urban Allen, a couple of times. So always a good time up at the residence as well in Ottawa. So we're happy to be here. My colleague Sonia is going to help with the slides, but also jump in on things that I forget. So I'll start out. So it's a small group, and so we can have more of a conversation than a presentation as people want to jump in and ask questions. But I'll go through some of the political landscape because I think it's an important context that we're going through right now. So right now there's a number of things going on. We'll have elections that'll be up in a few weeks in Alberta, an election this fall in Manitoba. We may see a change of government in Alberta, or the provincial government, and the odds are better that we may see a change in Manitoba. So both will change the political landscape in terms of the federal-provincial dynamic, we think. In Ottawa, the key thing is that the supply and confidence agreement between the NDP and the Liberal government we expect will remain in force. There's rumors that it will be further codified shortly to confirm that we won't see an election until 2025. Then we will, affordability, global competition, climate change, foreign agenda will dominate the politics. Continued attention on Indigenous reconciliation. This is a very big part of the Liberal government's mandate and their priorities. That will include Indigenous partnerships. So in our view, companies coming into Canada have to understand the Indigenous landscape completely, because it is that's an area of expertise of Sonia's. Just how that all works, how that will work for resource development, how that will work for locating facilities, etc. And Canada's place in the world will continue to evolve and respond to world events. You may have seen yesterday that Canada expelled a Chinese diplomat. There are currently trade discussions on such things as wind farmed towers that are going on through trade investigations. So lots of pressure also in the Canadian government from the G7, from the EU, from Indo-Pacific countries to do something with our vast resources more than we have been in terms of being able to supply, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's liquefied natural gas, whether it's hydrogen, to suddenly get on the ball and start to do more for supplying the world, because we have a lot of what the world needs, and we're a little bit behind, quite frankly, on this. So that's a little bit of the political landscape that helps frame the budget that we're going into. And so I'll go through the budget highlights. We'll talk. My expertise is energy and resources, but I do know enough about the manufacturing, healthcare, and transportation sectors and financial sector. We can talk about that. And if there's detailed questions I can't answer, I'm happy to provide one of my colleagues to get a response. So budget was still going through the process. It will pass. It's a question of timing. A couple of the highlights, just roughly a grocery rebate for low-income earners. There's a dental program that's a key part of the NDP Liberal agreement that will guarantee a stable government for the next couple of years. Introduction of some, but where the budget was entirely focused, or not entirely, but dedicated to responding to the Investment Recovery Act in the United States. If you're not familiar with that, that was a ambitious environmental and economic strategy plan put forth by the Biden administration that gave a lot of tax incentives to biofuels, to renewable energy, to hydrogen production, all down the line to green the economy and create what they call green jobs. This was considered an existential threat by the Canadian government, and they responded very quickly once the IRA was passed, and came up with a number of investment tax credits for clean technologies, electricity, and clean hydrogen. We'll get a little bit more into that in a minute. They've also pushed about $40 billion on to augment Canada's defense and security capabilities. This potentially is an opportunity for companies that are in that sector. A lot of focus on our northern sovereignty. It's, considering the space, we aren't well protected up there, and as the Chinese fishing fleets come north, the Russians are making incursions up there periodically, just in terms of submarines, etc. There's an expectation that the northern northern sovereignty will become an ongoing issue, and about $70 billion in spending between now and 2027-8, and what they expect is $5 billion in cost savings at the department level. How that will play out, we don't exactly know. So if we flip forward, Sonia. Yeah, so big focus is clean energy and minerals. Yeah, that's the one. So emission reduction and clean technology, all a part of being Canada net zero, is an important part of what the Canadian government is trying to do. Right now, there are 5 investment tax credits, one for hydrogen, carbon capture and utilization and storage, a clean technology, clean electricity, and clean manufacturing. Consultation will has to come on all these before legislation is tabled. And an important part, if you're into that world, are labor provisions that are very similar to the United States. And while it doesn't say you have to do union labor, the contract with your workers essentially is essentially based on what the prevailing union contracts are and collective bargaining agreements for construction trades in various jurisdictions. President Biden was up here at the end of March. Lots of discussion on clean minerals, hydrogen, and other technologies issues and they created something called the Canada-U.S. Energy Transformation Task Force, which also looks at electric vehicles and minerals as well as energy. Just as an aside, to this point, they haven't actually talked to anybody in the energy business how that works, but presumably that will come. And then further information on something called the Canada Growth Fund, which is an important part of the government's strategy. They are moving from a less of a grant base to more of an incentive base, but the Canada Growth Fund will play an important part in a few places. It's a $14 billion fund that will be attached to one of the pension funds to allow speedier governance and speedier stand-up. It will look at things like market support for new technologies. In case, say you're doing green hydrogen and the market price is lower than your price of production, it will provide possibly a top-up to match those prices. That's particularly important for some of the projects in Newfoundland that are looking to supply Germany, and they're going through their approval process right now. So that details on that is not fully clear yet, but getting closer to a reality, which is much faster than we expected. There's also something called the Canada Infrastructure Bank that will be providing funding for electrification, Indigenous resource development, and Indigenous owned transmission and generation. So lots happening, or lots of funding available. Sometimes it's hard to access, but clearly the government, this is a priority for us to green the economy, attract clean technology from around the world, and if possible, become an exporter of clean technologies or clean fuels, hydrogen being one, but critical mineral development, electric battery development. You're already seeing Volkswagen set up here in Ontario, a large plant near London, Ontario. Other plants are looking to set up in Quebec. There's a Belgian company setting up here in Ontario. So lots of activity on the battery side of things. And I also know that there are some Swedish companies kicking the tires here in Canada as well as a possibility for that type of development. So we can move on, or I say jump in if you've got any questions. Either just yell out or put your hand up. Sonia, could you advance that? So there's over the next 13 years to be $30 billion to recapitalize for funding for smart renewables, electrification, smart grid programs, science-based activities for offshore wind development. Newfoundland, there's been moratoriums on offshore wind in most areas, and this is starting to look at how they can bring in offshore wind and do collective environmental assessments on it. So that's something that's evolving, particularly off in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador. That's the most advanced in terms of that program. There are still some issues with offshore wind development in the BC area. There's also more $500 million in something called the Strategic Innovation Fund. And this was the preferred path of funding for Canada up until this budget and the investment tax credits. It provided money for a variety of projects. For example, 2 steel plants here in Ontario got money for converting from coal to electric arc furnaces to reduce their emissions. That will still be there, and there was some SIF money in the Volkswagen deal here in Ontario, and it will still be there for companies to access. And it is more aligned on what's on strategic government and Canadian policy, strategic goals and issues, so that may not qualify for the ITCs or may need supplemental funding for the ITCs. It's a long process and somewhat complicated, but so the ITCs are a bit more straightforward. So, but move forward, Sonia. Yeah, so healthcare, not a lot of new stuff in healthcare. Top-ups on some of the healthcare transfers. For those of you not familiar with the way that we work is that the federal government supplies transfers and the implementation of healthcare goes to the provinces. There's some tiered funding towards expanding access to primary care, supporting healthcare, healthy workforces, better access to addictions, and some of the things that all countries are grappling with, particularly post-COVID, overwhelmed healthcare systems, mental health issues, addiction issues that kind of got put under the radar as we've dealt with the COVID response. The dental one is going to be interesting because this will bring dental care to a lot of families who just don't have at work dental care. programs, and our $90,000 is still a fair amount of money, but it will give people dental care so that they won't have to pay for getting cavities filled, that type of thing. There seemed to be a net benefit to the Canadian healthcare system because there won't be getting into emergency care, et cetera, for other issues related to bad dental hygiene. So that's a large program. And then emphasis on health data as well. This is trying to build a new system for data sharing of patient records, and et cetera, because right now it is, we've still, and I don't know that we're unusual. I was at the doctor the other day, and I was asked to fax them something. So there is still a very antiquated system on data sharing. So this is an attempt by the federal government to work with provinces on this. So next slide. There. Yeah, so what wasn't in there, just a couple, I won't spend too much time. Some of the things that we had expected were funding for national pharmacare. This has been promised before. Drug pricing reforms and changes. This Patent and Medicines Price Review Board, my colleagues who do healthcare, and I should mention we do work in all these sectors, different parts of our company. The point for the federal government and this reform has been stalled. So that's something to be going on, looking for. And then support for life sciences, innovation, and biomanufacturing is something that also we'd be looking for in the next little while from the federal government. So move on there. So transportation supply, again, there's so much focus on the clean energy and critical minerals and battery development, et cetera, that a lot of the things that we expected weren't there. There wasn't a lot on transportation, for example. There are some supply chain issues that are being developed, transportation supply chain issues that we'll look at. One of the keys that they wanted to do is try to look at how do we maintain resiliency and fluidity in the system. And if we could move on to the next one on that. So the one thing that's interesting, and it's somewhat embarrassing if you go to other countries, just how bad our passenger rail system is here in Canada. I mean, it's not, it's horrible, but compared to other countries, it's quite embarrassing. So there was funding for Via Rail to conduct broader maintenance and to maintain the levels of service across the network. The one that's interesting, if you were into rail transport in a big way, is a pilot project to allow interswitching in the prairie provinces. This has created some resistance from the two large rail companies, but essentially what it means is that if I'm a railway line owned by Canadian National Railways, and I'm a Canadian Pacific customer, I can move my stuff on a CN rail. And the concept is supposed to increase competition, reduce bottlenecks if there are labor issues, which we've seen on the CN system lately. A lot of opposition, as I said, from the rail companies who think it's not going to work, but it's a little bit interesting to see how that actually works in terms of how you can get more flexibility and competition on the railway, and then more information, more passenger rights, which are coming through for people who have been bounced from airlines that if their flights are canceled, etc. All these things are still in the works. So. And then finally, on the financial services, some things there, and I must confess this is not my expertise, but one of the things, treating dividends on Canadian shares as business income, payday lending exemptions to charge no more than $14 per $100, lower credit card exchange rates, interchange rates, guidelines on regulated financial institutions, which are supposed to come, and amendments to criminal code to allow enforcement of money laundering, et cetera. So I think that's one. We got a couple more to go. These are, again, some of the things, not the broad stuff on the financial sector, but one of the things is broader powers for the Minister of Finance to impose due diligence requirements to protect the financial system from national security threats. So similar to some of the powers that evolved out of the COVID response, that's where the government seems to want to go, is to give the Minister of Finance a bit more emergency power as needed. So, and then more disclosure on exposure to crypto assets, as we saw, that can be very damaging to a number of firms who have money in there. So, move on. There, I think that's pretty much the overview of the budget. So again, high focus of this government on critical minerals, clean technology. The one thing that we were expecting, because there was a lot of pressure from Indigenous groups that wasn't there, and we may see through further developments in Parliament, is some kind of Aboriginal loan guarantee or First Nation support to allow them greater equity in resource projects and energy projects. If you follow this file closely, you'll find that the trend of most companies is to realize that they're going to have to work with First Nations in there and have some First Nation partnership. That could be equity, it could be revenue sharing, it could be a host of things. What the First Nations, in terms of economic reconciliation goals, lack is access to capital. And so trying to get that money to capital is an important part of the equation of economic reconciliation. So we're a little bit surprised, given the government's priorities, that it wasn't there. But that being said, I should have mentioned this. There is supposed to be an investment tax credit being developed on biofuels, because that was absent in the discussion in this budget. Folks who are doing sustainable airline fuels and other biofuels from agriculture or renewable natural gas felt left out. So they're being looked whether they can add them to the investment tax credits. So anyway, that's a bit, and then there's a little bit about us. We have offices across Canada in a wide range of subject areas, and I think we're the largest privately owned public affairs company in Canada. And again, we're really happy to be part of the Swedish Chamber. We're a member of a couple of other groups, the Ukrainian Chamber and the German Chamber, and we find them really interesting ways to exchange ideas and get to know folks. So we're really enjoying the relationship so far. So anyway, I'll turn it over to you if anyone has any questions. Again, small group, but I think we make up in quality what we lacked in quantity. So, Lynn.
Yeah, so thank you, Ted. That was really interesting. Good little overview. I am interested in most of this, but particularly healthcare. Can we go back, Sonia? I think it was number 8 slide. I just had we talked about healthcare and the budget allocation. One, yeah.
Or back one, yeah. One more. There.
Yeah, so what's your thoughts, Ted? So I've been spending a number of decades in healthcare. Of course, you know, one of the topics now with primary and secondary care for Canada, and you know, it's apropos that they're comparing themselves to the Swedish model, where we actually have some private healthcare available, and we've met with some resistance here. And you know, I think this all sort of, if you back up a little bit, it started with the COVID. We had a whole workforce of healthcare professionals, clinicians to others, just burned out completely.
Right.
It just tapped out and maxed out our system to the point that not just the waiting times and waiting rooms, but even for a procedure, were really unacceptable if we looked at the global standards for those kind of things. So, you know, the private clinics sort of came in, and there was some support from the provincial government here to have, and we do have some private clinics. And then, of course, you had the issues with the unions feeling that that may not be in our best interest, and so forth. What's your take on the availability, if you will, of private clinics, and how do you think that would affect the budget?
Great question. Again, healthcare is not my area of expertise, but I do follow the politics of this a lot. So my feeling is that part of the debate will be a semantic debate over what is private versus public healthcare? Like I mentioned, I was at the doctor the other day. It's a private clinic. The doctors are self-employed. Within the clinic is a blood, I can go down and get blood tests at a private clinic. I can go get MRI at a private clinic. I can get most of the and then a lot of the extra care is technically private, but they don't call it that. So I think there'll be a debate over privately run and publicly funded. I think so I think that will be a semantic debate that the folks I don't like to use these terms necessarily, but say the center left of the spectrum would want to focus more on public health care without really acknowledging that most of the delivery is actually private already in some form or another, or a lot of it is. And so I think you'll see, as the strain goes on, more turn to the private sector. The challenge would be, does that survive politically, and does it add to the cost either through just budget costs or out of my pocket? And that's where I think that the rub point will be, is what does it actually cost me? I think the public would accept faster healthcare regardless of who delivered it, as long as it's still under that guise of publicly funded.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I share that opinion. I think that's the only way we are going to actually get some kind of balance in the providing healthcare to everybody who needs. And I think that, yeah, you may not want to call it private clinics, but they do exist, clinics, and they do act as a fuse, really. They take away a little pressure from some of the hospitals, and the cost really remains. Clinics can operate, in my view, at least at the same level of cost as a hospital can, possibly even less. So I'm just interested to hear what your comments were, but I think it's a road that we have to embrace and figure out how to do it efficiently.
Yeah, I think that's that. And we, disclosure, we do some work on that field, so we're not entirely objective, but I don't work in it. So I just think that's the way it'll have to go. There'll be some challenges on, do private clinics end up with the low risk patients, and high risk go to hospitals? Talent attraction it will be interesting in terms of pay, etc. So these are all things I think you can manage, but I think you just have to collectively realize we have a problem and how to fix the problem. And unfortunately, it's something that with our provincial federal squabbling, we're not always good at, but there are signs that this is being achieved, that there's perhaps more conversation happening behind the scenes on a lot of files than the political rhetoric would suggest.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.
Any other questions, comments, challenges?
I've got lots, Ted.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah, we've got
Actually,
time. So, yeah.
When it comes to the clean tech sector and the acceleration of clean technologies as we transition from where we are to where we want to be, I feel one of the biggest pain points is getting the exposure from the startups and scale-ups with the big industry leaders, because we can't transition without products and services, and they have to move from the fossil fuel era technologically to the clean tech era, whether we're talking about hydrogen or anything else. And I think there's a huge disconnect as the industry leaders struggle to get an audience or find how to connect with a lot of the startups that are focused on the adoption of new technologies. I think we don't do that effectively today. I'm working with some Swedish innovation companies in the hydrogen space. At the same time, I'm working with some of the world leaders in existing technologies. And of course, they've got people on their side trying to connect with, and they don't care if they're Swedish tech companies or
Right.
German or anything else. They don't care. They want to know what the next best thing is going to be, because their central focus is on make, buy, or partner. What are they going to do? What makes most sense for them? And these are both publicly traded companies or privately traded companies. So it's getting, the focus on where the technology is going to bring and give birth to new products and services and infrastructure and all the rest of it. And I don't know if we're doing that very effectively at all.
Yeah, there are some attempts through the technology hubs, Mars and groups like that. But I think you're right that there are net zero accelerator funds, etc. But I think you're trying to bridge that gap between someone who's got a new technology that a big company may want is a gap, and I see that in the last year or so we've started to do a lot of hydrogen work. We were this is all public, so we work with the Hydrogen Association of Canada, and we also work with a number of hydrogen developers on the blue and green side. My history in hydrogen was interesting because a friend of mine's grandfather invented one of the first electrolyzers in Canada 100 years ago. And their family is still in the business, but they struggled with that. How do we get attention? How do we get involved? And they're now involved with ABB, but it took them a long time. So that exposure to international, that reluctance to give up IP, all sorts of things have been an impediment. And I think that's something we could do better. Whether through the budget or just policy or government acting as an intervener. But I would say, though, that one of the things that's interesting about the ITCs in particular is that right now they're green fields in terms of how they will be rolled out. So there is opportunity as they go through the various consultations, because the caveat and caution on these is that while they're effective the day the budget was announced in March, they're not actually law yet until they put in the case of, like, say, carbon capture, that was announced but almost 2 years ago in a budget, still not technically law yet. So we're expecting that to become law in the fall, because they've done a number of consultations, revamping of the regulations. So the challenge, I think, for investors is, do I really want to, until I know it's actually there, should I invest money? Should I start to, dig a hole in the ground or put up a structure? So we are sensing a little bit of investor reluctance on that front. And then layered onto that, not budget related, but there's a lot of on the energy side in particular, a lot of things coming that will be of interest to folks in the energy environment and efficiency space. There's something called the Clean Electricity Regulations, which will come out in June, and that will dictate a net zero grid that's supposed to be in place by 2035. We expect a new version of the Green Building Standard, which will mandate efficiency and eventually will mandate no natural gas hookups in new homes. So you wouldn't be able to have a natural gas stove if you were buying a new house. That would be in the Canada Building Code. And then we expect, and this is more for the oil and gas sector, but it will have ripple effects, we believe, what the next version of the emission cap on the oil and gas sector will look like. This would have potential impact on things like refineries, liquefied natural gas plants in the West Coast. And then back to the clean electricity regulations, lots of concern over how that will affect cogeneration facilities and industrial regions. I know of a few in Ontario that are quite concerned that will disrupt their business plans. And then there's a number out in Alberta that we deal with that are worried about the same thing. And then the other one that's of interest is, we don't think there's an election for 2 years, but there is some concern in industry who have made investment based on what they assume will be carbon pricing, and it's the trend to $170 a ton through the federal programs. The Conservatives are somewhat vague as to what their policy will look like, and our view is that if there was an election today, the results would be more or less the same, give or take a few points here and there. But if the Conservatives do get in and they do make ultimate changes to the industrial carbon pricing regimes, it could skew a number of the business plans companies have put in place. So part of the engagement we're advising is to make sure that if you've got a vested interest in some of the status quo, that the policymakers and the Conservatives are aware of that, because sometimes they assume they work on the model that if the Liberals put it in place, it must be bad, so we're going to get rid of it without stopping to think. So, and unfortunately, the Liberals do the same thing. So, the idea we've lost the ability to go back and look at a policy and say it's not a bad idea. Let's keep it in place. So, these are all things coming. It's going to be a busy time in the next little while, and then, as we've seen in the last year or two, there's lots of unknowns that we don't know. I mean, the war in Ukraine was possibly predictable, but things like COVID, other world events are interesting. We also, as the Indo-Pacific strategy unfolds and the relationship with China gets more complicated, is that an opportunity for Swedish companies and other companies in Europe? I would argue yes, but I will also notice that the Canadian government is also realizing that, hey, Europe's not a bad place to talk to. I know one consul general, when he arrived in Toronto 4 years ago, could not get an attention from the provincial government. Their focus entirely was on BRIC countries. And suddenly in the last 2 years, they realized, hey, the European countries and our companies are pretty good. So we're seeing a lot more investment just because they're spending more time in Europe.
Well, private companies are driven differently. They don't care about, they're just looking for. Let me ask you this question, Ted. I'm sitting in Hamilton, Ontario, so it's not lost on me the investment through ArcelorMittal, which is the largest steel manufacturing facility in Canada. And it's not a secret that the Swedes are in first place when it comes to the transition to green steel. Investments have been made. They've got demonstration projects with Hybrid in the north of Sweden. They have the technologies in place. They're tried and true. And they are manufacturing green technology from a number of different sources. Because this is a Swedish chamber and looking through this Swedish lens, what perspective can we bring to companies like ArcelorMittal, who are run through head office in Luxembourg and Belgium? But this is the largest employer in Hamilton. And as you mentioned earlier, investments have been made both provincially and federally. And in the city of Hamilton, the city has invested in a relationship with the Transition Accelerator, which is a charitable organization with a bunch of PhDs out in Edmonton that have a proven concept with hydrogen in Edmonton. But the city of Hamilton is now creating a hydrogen hub here, because it's not just the steel industry, it's transportation, innovation, technology. How can we, as a Swedish organization or a country, bring to bear where we're at and what we could bring to this country so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? Which we will, because you don't know what you don't know. I've sat in enough meetings and we're inventing stuff that's been invented a long time ago.
It's a great question, and so my background was with the electricity industry in Ontario. I worked for Ontario Power Generation, and before that was Ontario Hydro, and I worked for the system operator in the Ministry of Energy here. When wind farms started to become a big deal, there was this, we have to study them under Canadian conditions because we don't know how they work. And there was a kind of this thought of, well, they use them everywhere else. We're not that different. So there is a reluctance, I would call it a Canadian exceptionalism, that we know better than anybody else, that how to do things, whether we do or not. There is this belief
with
that we
zero proof.
No, well, and not
with no proof.
But there is a Canadian exceptionalism that permeates, and I think that that's part of the barrier. I think part of it is awareness that there's again, Sweden is one of those countries that we just sort of know is there, but don't probably just on a policy basis don't really understand. But I think that in the last year or so, through the work of the chamber, through the work of the ambassador, through the work of the ambassador in Canada as well, and Swedish companies coming here and raising their hand and saying, "Hey, we're actually really good at this stuff." But there is a bias, I think, to say, well, we've got, we know how to do these things. You're a small country. What do you know about it? Without really understanding. On some places where, okay, there's a country, and I can't remember the population of Sweden, apologizes, but nowhere near Canada, nowhere near the size, nowhere near the access to some of the resources. But we're out there courting Swedish companies to come here, and we don't have the Canadian expertise. So on that Hamilton part, I think that part of it is frustrating because I think there's to keep plugging, but it's being awareness, being the policymakers are aware of the Swedish connection and Swedish companies and what they can and what they're already doing. It's challenging though. I understand your frustration because we see that with other companies that we work for, where they come in. There's also a bit of a protectionist mindset that you're here to take away my business as opposed to help my business, or maybe we can partner on business. So we can be very protectionist, even though we're a trading nation or theoretically a trading nation on certain elements, where the big players who are considered Canadian but aren't, as you say, headquartered in Luxembourg. Our Canadian beers are headquartered in Belgium and places like that. So having that resistance, because there's often a branch plant mentality as well. That's like, I don't want my place to go to business because I have to keep Luxembourg happy.
Yeah.
I didn't answer your question, but it is a puzzle. Particularly, I think, though, that is changing. Like I said, I used to be part of a group called Invest. I think it's now called Invest Toronto. And the staff, I was on the board, and the staff never went to Europe, and they always went to Brazil and India and Russia and places like that, and China, because that was where they thought the investment, and Europe wasn't on the radar. I think world events have changed that a lot.
Yeah, Sweden has a lot of big tech companies that are globally recognized for 100 years. Canada doesn't have that legacy, and these are fundamental technologies that don't go away.
Yeah,
I mean, bearings in power transmission or fluid power and mechatronics. Sweden has been in that space for a long time. Canada has not, with few exceptions. So
and
we're not a leader; we're a follower.
Well, and we used to have leadership in some areas, but then we decided not to be. So but you're seeing some I've seen that big investment by Ericsson recently in R&D here. So but just knowing a lot of small, and Marie's got her hand up, small developers, that gap between, particularly in the hydrogen side, of how do I get attention of big players is something that's lacking and something that needs to be worked on.
Well, hydrogen is one of those exceptions. Canada's been a big leader for a long time, together with Germany and Japan. So that's, unfortunately, we're manufacturing for applications that we don't have a lot of use for here in Canada. That one of them being rail and big marine applications and battery transitions. And so, yeah.
Right, Marie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just very quickly want to circle back to national security threats. It was mentioned in regards to the financial services, if I understood the presentation right. But the defense at large, what's the reaction in the Canadian budget to help and support the Ukraine conflict or war in Ukraine? Is there a number? Is there an approach that took up with that's in the budget?
There is. I don't have it on the top of my head. I'd have to look that up. There is money allocated. The challenge, though, is we have good intentions, but we also don't have a lot to send people. We don't fund our military particularly well, so we don't have a lot of the modern technology. We're not like Sweden was able to send modern technology in terms of weaponry. We don't have our own that we're developing, so we didn't have a lot to send. We had some, I think we sent some armored vehicles from the company in London, perhaps. But you know, in terms of things like how, you know, artillery, I mean, I think we pretty much depleted our artillery shells and our own. So it's an area where we have committed to doing better, but we've been committed to doing better on that for as long as I've been around. And we're unfortunately, and I think there is some signs this is changing, but we as a country are very good at announcing things. We're not very good at following through things. High-speed rail being one of them. We've talked about building high-speed rail as long as I can remember. Never actually got around to do it, but if you looked at the announcements, we probably would have already done it. So, so this is going to be a challenge, I think. But this is where you get into that national discussion of there is thoughts when Canada shows up at the G7 and the G20, NATO, etc. So what are you bringing to the table? And I think this is, you know, I've mentioned to Adam that Canadian exceptionalism. I think there was a thought, hey, we belong here, but there's a realization that maybe we need to step up and actually show why we belong. And that can be improved GDP, it can be improved defense spending, it can be improved resource exports, improved manufacturing processes.
Okay, thank you.
And Ted, I'll just add, Marie, I do have the data for the Ukraine support that Canada committed to in budget 2023. So Canada, the federal government committed to an additional $2.4 billion to Ukraine, and this is mostly in humanitarian assistance. So looking at helping with, you know, heating homes and essential services. Also, there's been a big emphasis on providing Ukrainians with temporary resettlement in Canada. I think there was over 200,000 Ukrainians who have arrived in Canada since the war started. And so the understanding is the focus is more on humanitarian assistance rather than defense, although there has been funding in that area as well. I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you.